We see people coming in from all parts of the world, which is good. We have 161 people registered from some 100 countries, and we hope they will be able to make it into this space. I would like to start already by thanking the Boston College and the Center for International Higher Education for offering the opportunity to meet on the Zoom platform of Boston College. And we hope it will be conducive to good listening, no interruptions, good quality for all, and also be conducive for very good discussions on the future of higher education. I believe that we should start. We have all the presenters with us, as you can see on the screen. And we're also very pleased to see that now we should be able to start with a good number of participants. So it's a very great honor for me. Edith van 't Land is my name. I'm the Secretary General of the International Association of Universities. Very pleased to welcome you to the fourth session of the IAU webinar series on the future of higher education, short, medium, and long term. One of the important transformations for many of the associations around the world has been to move most of its activities online, as has been the case for most universities around the world. And the first thing we thought we could do best as an association with a global scale like the International Association of Universities is reach out to the universities and ask them what about the impact of the pandemic on their institution, the practices, and the different stakeholders within. We obviously knew that it was a big challenge for universities in the time they were going through to also at the same time respond to a survey like the one we submitted to them. So we're particularly thankful to the 400 some universities who took the time to actually engage with us in this exercise and to fill in the questionnaire and provide with a very good basis for understanding of the situation at higher education institutions around the world at a certain point in time. We know what the challenge that each global survey comes with. It is time-bound, it is due to be outdated to some extent for certain parts of a survey, but this was an excellent opportunity to actually go around the world and understand better what impacts were actually most important for universities around the world as induced by COVID-19. So I believe that it's important to have this first baseline study report, and it will allow us to launch a second such survey in the fall and dig deeper in certain aspects that we will also highlight today, and then to carry out a third survey in the series in 2021, and there to look at lessons learned, also the impacts for the future of higher education more specifically. So I'm very pleased to today welcome 4 speakers to the webinar room with one major presentation by Giorgio Marinoni, the Manager Internationalization of the International Association of Universities and the main author of the survey report on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. And we've decided to then invite 3 speakers to zoom in on different aspects that were highlighted by the survey questionnaire and also by the report. 3 speakers from 3 different parts of the world, from Europe, the European University Association, Michael Gebel, who will look more specifically at teaching and learning and at the disruption there and the impacts today. Marta Losada, who is also an IAU board member and who's the Dean of Science at the New York University of Abu Dhabi, and she will look more specifically at the impacts of COVID-19 as highlighted by the survey and also the situation today a bit on research specifically, and Hans de Witt, the director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College, to look specifically at the dimensions as impacted by COVID-19, the dimensions on the internationalization of higher education. Just for your information, this idea came out of another one that you may be interested to learn about as well. And that is that during the IEU virtual global meeting of associations, we introduced the idea of the global report and the sequencing with the first survey carried out now and a report that will be presented, a second one in the fall and the third one in 2021. And that is where actually Michael Gebel and the EUA offered to also offer in the future regional perspectives on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education using the global report as a starting point. And that will allow to continue the dialogue on the different dimensions and impacts of the pandemic on higher education for today and into the future. And so this is kind of a declination of that beautiful idea. And thank you, Michael, for having suggested that, because I think this makes it even more so dynamic. So I would like to start and give the floor to Giorgio Marinoni, who has been one of the key actors as well in developing the global survey itself, and then to analyze it and provide for the report that is now available free and online for all to read. He's the manager, as I said, of higher education and internationalization at the IEU. The floor is yours, Giorgio.
Thank you, Ilike. Thank you very much to all participants. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are very pleased to have many people here today with us. And this is the first time that we present the result of the IU Global Survey on the impact of COVID-19. So we are very pleased to have this kind of preview with you. And we are really looking forward to your reaction and your question, which you can write in the chat and which will be replied not only by me, but also by all the intervenants after the presentation. So very quickly, some important data on the survey. The first one is the time of the survey. The survey was an online survey and was open between 25th of March and 17th of April. Why this is important? Because we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is a pandemic that has come through different phases in different parts of the world in time. So it's important to know at which stage the world, which part of the world was at that time. And we will come back to this when we will speak about the results. The time was short because we really wanted to have a picture of the impact of COVID-19 on higher education. And as the situation was evolving rapidly, we couldn't leave it open for long, but we were very happy to have 424 unique replies, so only one from one higher education institution in 111 countries and territories around the world. And the number of replies we gathered through the survey allowed us to perform a regional analysis in 4 different regions of the world. As you can see, Africa, Americas, Asia Pacific, and Europe. Just one word, unfortunately, the number of replies for North America was not relevant to allow to distinguish between Latin America and North America. That's the reason why we have only one region, the whole of the Americas. And the surveys, as you can see, was trilingual, and the majority of replies were in English. Next, please. So the title of the survey was The Impact of COVID-19 on Higher Education Institution. You might see in the graph, and you might say that this is something that we already know, because actually we have other organizations that are counting even the number of institutions which were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemics. UNESCO, for instance, is still keeping accounting on how many institutions, and not only higher education institutions, but all level of educations have been closed around the world, and how many learners have been impacted. So why asking a question like this? In a way to see if our data is consistent with different data. And this is nothing surprising. The majority of institutions were indeed closed at the time that our survey was launched. But a little bit more interesting is the data that is coming from the regional analysis, because actually Africa is the region with the highest percentage of institutions closed. And this might be surprising, and it's telling us something interesting. Why surprising? Surprising because at the time of the survey, Africa, as it is right now, was the region of the world with the least number of COVID-19 cases. So somebody would expect that it's the least affected region. But instead, in Africa, what happened that probably institutions and governments decided to close the institution as a preemptive measure. So we see that there was something already done in advance in respect to all other regions of the world. And this is something interesting to keep in mind, because it might not have been the case. Next, please. So the global survey was structured in 3 big parts. And the 3 big parts were describing the effect of the COVID-19 pandemics on the 3 main parts of the mission of higher education institution, namely teaching and learning, research, and service to society or community engagement, call it as you prefer. Again, not surprising, we see from our survey that the majority of higher education institutions in the world have been affected by teaching and learning. And actually, what is more interesting is that the majority of education institutions around the world replied quite effectively, quite quickly to the disruption brought by the pandemic, moving teaching online. So this is something which is in a way a positive effect, but we have to keep in mind that this has been something like a reaction to a crisis. So something done very quickly and which has bringing with itself challenges and also problems of access, problems of quality, problems of methodology, of pedagogy. So there are still many open questions, and I'm sure that Michael later on will also bring his perspective on how this switch from face-to-face to online teaching and learning has happened, and how will evolve in the future, because this opens up to many questions. Okay, this was crisis management at the moment, but what will happen next? What will happen in next semester? What will happen in the next academic year? Next, please. On research, again, not surprising, majority of institutions here were also affected. More surprising is the way that research was affected in different parts of the world, but more important, the means of scientific research that were more affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Very easy, of course, the major impact has been on international travel, on scientific conferences, which were canceled. But more worrisome is the fact that we see that even half of our respondents are saying that scientific research projects are in danger of not being successfully completed. And we even have a non-negligible percentage of institutions that are reporting that all scientific research has stopped. And this is something to be worried about, because we can see that a pandemic like COVID-19, it's a global challenge. And of course, global challenges can be solved only through global solutions. So research and collaboration, international collaboration in research would need to be boosted in a situation like this. But of course, there are some limits that have been caused by the pandemic, which kind of downsize the collaboration at international level on research. And this is something to reflect upon, and how to move from this situation through getting back more collaboration in research. And I'm sure that Marta will comment more about it in her intervention. Next, please. For what concerns internationalization and specifically student mobility, this has been one of the dimensions most affected by the pandemics. Again, this is not surprising. But here we can also see a double effect of the pandemic. On one side, of course, there is the negative effect. So the pandemic has stopped student exchanging, has stopped student recruitment, has even blocked some students in institutions abroad. So it caused a lot of problems for students. But on the other hand, COVID-19 can be seen as an opportunity to face some intrinsic problems connected with student mobility. For instance, the fact that student mobility is elitist, is touching only a very small percentage of the population, the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic forced higher education institutions to look to alternatives to student mobility, in a way promoted the use of collaborative online learning, of virtual mobility, which were maybe not seen so important until now. So we can see in a way a negative effect, of course, but on the other way, an opening up of an opportunity to make mobility more inclusive, for instance, with more virtual mobility. Of course, this has the same challenges that online teaching has, so we have to see how this can be implemented in a qualitative manner and what can bring as benefits to students in the long run. Next, please. Similar positive and negative effects at the same time we can see on two different aspects, one still related with internationalization, which is international partnership, and the other one being the third dimension of missions of higher education institution, community engagement. As you can see from the two graphs, we see that different higher education institutions in the world have, in a way, had a different impact of the pandemic. For some, the partnerships have been weakened, and for others, the partnership have been either strengthened or the pandemic has opened up new opportunities to create new partnerships. For community engagement, is more or less the same. For some higher education institutions, the pandemic has increased the community engagement, while for others has decreased it. So this combination of positive and negative effects is ringing a bell, an alarm bell, because it's telling us that there might be a risk of growing inequality, or even better, probably a risk that the pandemic is kind of widen the existing inequality in higher education. And this is something to keep in mind and something to be controlled and fought in the future for the development in the next academic year. Next, please. To conclude this short presentation of the results of the survey report on COVID-19, I would like to conclude on a positive note. And the positive note is coming up from the contribution to public policies. In the survey, there were two questions that were asking higher education institutions if their leadership and their faculty members were contributing to public policies, and another set of questions which was asking them if they were conducting research on COVID-19 and if these researchers conducting COVID-19 have been consulted for public policy. And the result is pretty positive, because if we combine these two sets of results, we see that 3/4 of institutions are indeed contributing to public policy. What does this mean? This means that society is recognizing the value of research, the values of higher education institutions as knowledge-based centers. So in a way, this crisis is also opening up an opportunity for the higher education community to take back its place in society and to give a very positive contribution to society, in a way counterbalancing a tendency that was a tendency of expert bashing, of post-truth that we saw existing in many different countries of the world. And I'm sure that Hans de Witt in his intervention will comment on these last points that I presented you. Next, please. I will not read this slide because this is just mainly for you to summarize what I have just said. What I want to say here is just that these results are just some of the results of the survey report on COVID-19. There were other aspects, but the main aspects have been touched upon, and I'm looking forward to your questions and to the debate with the three experts, which will have the floor now. Next slide, please. So I thank you very much for the time of this short presentation. If you want to read the full report, it's available on the IAU website. It's an electronic report. It's completely free of charge, so you can just go to that address and download it. And now I will give back the floor to Ilic, and I'm looking forward, as I said before, to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Giorgio, and I hope you appreciated this presentation. Obviously, it will trigger many questions on many parts of the world as well. As we said before, this was taken in a very specific time and period of time, also as far as it impacted higher education in many parts of the world. And today we're already in a little bit new phase, I would say, and maybe that is also what we will hear from the commenters on 3 different aspects that we decided to highlight because they are so much in the spotlight today. So I would like to start with you, Michael, and give you the floor. You are, as I said earlier, but to repeat and position also your reaction maybe to this presentation, you're the Higher Education Policy Director at the European University Association. And at the EUA, you also look at all these dimensions. You looked at it actually before, and you look at it again today in light of everything that is happening around the world. So it will be very interesting to hear what you have to comment on the different points raised in the survey, but way beyond probably. So the floor is yours. I hope you're given the microphone and that we have to ask. No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks so much. Well, thanks, Helike and Giorgio, for the presentation and also for the invitation here. And indeed, it's the one issue that keeps, of course, our work busy at the moment, in addition to everything else, which I think in Europe very much continues. Can I have the next slide, please? Just for those who don't know us, we are the European University Association, so a membership organization. We bring more than 850 universities and university associations in Europe together. And it's the wider Europe, so not just the European Union, but the Europe of the Council of Europe with 48 countries. And we are, on the one hand side, we are a forum for members to collaborate and exchange. And on the other hand, we also contribute in the European context to policy making in the EU and also in the Bologna process. And we are also involved in international dialogue and cooperation with sister organizations around the world. And of course, we are an active IAU member. We have now been in confinement since 12th of March. So the whole office is working online from different parts in Europe and sometimes also internationally. And that works actually relatively well. Can I have the next slide? And I think that's also reflecting a little bit the realities in general in Europe. So the campuses are closed since March, but in some cases a little bit earlier, but the universities continue. And what you see here on the left-hand side, you cannot really see it. That was a map that the European Commission provided, the Eurydice agency, in April about closure and opening. And we looked at it and we found out that it wasn't really correct. I mean, actually, all institutions their campuses are closed, but they are operating in reality. And the map is not entirely correct because despite the fact that the government allowed some institutions to reopen again, the institutions took often collectively the decision not to open and to remain more or less closed until the summer to get some planning certainty. So what has happened is, as Giorgio said already, in most cases overnight within a week, the translation from physical, whatever you do physical, to remote. And for learning and teaching, I think that has been also relatively successful. We can see differences because institutions and systems were differently prepared for that. Those who were already engaged in digitally enhanced learning provided a lot of online and had clear better resources, were in a better position. We also think to see a difference where in systems where the rectors' conferences supported the developments, where there was an existing forum for collaboration between institutions. And generally, I think what we have seen is that they were given a relatively high degree of autonomy in doing that, so emergency measures. And we think it's also because government realized early on that they were not able to manage that top down. That said, institutions found out then very quickly that there were some regulatory obstacles. For example, in some systems, you need to be physically present on campus to do your exams or to get your study period recognized. So it was, well, as I wrote there, successful and at the same time stressful. It worked fairly well, but it was a stress test for the entire institution staff and students. And there were clearly some shortcomings. And while institutions might not put that up on their websites, they talk to you quite candidly. So it's quite clear that it was challenging in particular to ensure that students from disadvantaged backgrounds stay involved, stay connected in learning and teaching. And while technical issues, so access to internet, computers, and was one issue, that was probably not the most important one. It's also about the whole study support and psychological issues. And can I have the next slide, please? I think what is interesting at the moment is in Europe, the academic year actually comes to an end. You know, the question comes up: what happens from autumn on, and probably also belong. And again, I think what we can see now is that higher education institutions are not necessarily aligned with the reopening that takes place in most European countries. So while shops and in many places restaurants and bars and museums are opening again, and also schools, I think what we hear from universities is that they are not entirely sure that they can go back to business as normal. It's very different how universities prepare for that. Some of them are still waiting. Others have several scenarios for all kinds of cases developed. I think what you could see as a likely scenario, which we hear from several of our members, is that there will be a kind of hybrid approach because the situation will not allow that everybody comes back to campus as it was before the crisis. So physical lectures where you would bring many people together, they will be replaced by online and podcasts. And I think most institutions announced that they would abandon them for the moment. This is sometimes misunderstood that the whole education would transfer to digital, which is clearly not the case. So what institutions usually plan then is to have smaller groups, so kind of tutorials, for example, 10 students per group, and that there will be exceptions for labs, exams, and an end. In particular, some universities also try to offer blended or distance at choice. So taking into considerations that some students might not be able or not willing or should for health reasons not attend on physical presence, should not be physically present on campus. This would also consider then the situation of international students, but I come back to that in a moment. What is also a discussion and in process at many institutions is to replace what we call remote emergency provision by high quality distance and hybrid. Giorgio mentioned it already. So we should not kid ourselves, you know, while this worked fairly well, it is not it leaves out many aspects that come to play in a student experience. And I think that's currently under consideration. So it may require the whole revision of the curriculum, the way how you teach and how students learn. And that takes, of course, place in a situation which is not easy. So it's a huge pedagogical question. There are organizational issues, and then also likely financial challenges, because we haven't really heard about that universities would get more money to do that, at least not in most of the systems. This will not be the case, and particularly not due to the current crisis. Can I have the next one, please? A word about internationalization. My impression was, but we don't have data on that, that it was not in the first reaction. So at most institutes, there was a focus on domestic affairs, probably with the exception of institutions which had high numbers of international students at campus. But we could see in some institutions and systems that there were specific challenges for international students. And Giorgio, that came out quite clearly out of your survey. They were somehow often in transition at home, abroad, or somewhere within between. And what we could also see is that there were delays or postponement of international cooperation. My impression is, however, that it is now back. We feel that by the conversations that we have with members. We had a round with the Secretary Generals of the National Rectors Conferences across Europe 2 weeks ago, and their international exchange and cooperation was clearly one of the priority issues to be addressed. And what we can also see is that now a catch-up on digital moves start, because this may have been neglected anyhow in international exchange and cooperation so far, which was really about physically present and travel. What is currently still a problem is that borders are still closed. The visa situation, some of the embassies and consulates are closed. Institutions are trying to revise their application procedures to allow students to apply from abroad, and also entry tests. And in some cases, there is an obstacle because the applicant has to be in the country, so there are legal issues. And there are also in some countries quarantine measures. And overall, as I said, the borders are still closed. There's talk now about the EU borders, which will open again from the 15th on, but the international borders remain closed for the moment. A question is also what will be, as digital remote provision is one of the options in the future, what will be the reaction not only, but also of international students and stuff on that. And we know already from surveys that some students or potential students decided to postpone or look for safer options. Depending on the survey you look at, it's between 15 and 70%. So we will have to see what happens then in reality. But it's quite likely that there will be less students international students around in the autumn. And it is also what is also quite visible that many students don't like the option to go abroad to study, but then having to do that in a remote or in a hybrid fashion. Another issue that is, of course, a bit specific to Europe, but also concerns the rest of the world is what is happening actually with the European programs. We can see the Commission has done a very good job there. I mean, for the spring semester, they announced that there should be highest possible flexibility under the force majeure regime. And it was up then for national agencies and higher education institutions to decide what they would do. And obviously this resulted then that in every countries and institutions, the reaction was very differently, but honestly, I wouldn't have known how else to manage that than just give it to the institutions and let them decide how to continue or not to continue, or to also what we have seen to move the Erasmus experience to virtual exchanges. What is still pending at the moment is what is going to happen in the autumn. I mean, it's likely that the flexibility will continue. A question is at the moment whether a fully virtual Erasmus would also be an eligible measure. Can I have the next one, please? The next slide, please. So to summarize, you could see, as Giorgio said, there are clearly some opportunities for advancement and innovation, in particular for learning and teaching, probably also for internationalization, and we believe even also for research in this. What we can also see that the crisis has been a magnifier and amplifier for whatever challenge, pre-existing challenge you had. And in particular, we can see that this socioeconomic inequality, that this came out much stronger and was much more visible than probably before. What we can see is, and that's actually a plus, the role of universities have been emphasized. We appear in the public also as rather resilient. We have managed to continue, and our education, research and innovation, and also contribution to society, that's actually quite positive. And there are opportunities for enhancing not only learning and teaching, but also the other missions. What has been, colleagues at the institutions, they describe this very much as joining the dots. You are under pressure to act, you have to do something, and you start to realize some of the opportunities that you had at your institutions, but that you never did. I mean, digital means were around before, but they were not necessarily mainstreamed within the institution, and I think this is what we see now. What I think is still to be explored is probably the possibilities for inter-university cooperation. We have been asking ourselves for a long time. So we have seen that learning and teaching becomes a topic for cooperation, or has become a topic for inter-institutional exchange and cooperation between institutions. But what is still open, to what extent they can actually cooperate then, for example, on the delivery of courses. So we had examples here of a national platform where every university in the crisis then put up its courses, but there were not courses, for example, changed by institutions. But on other areas, you see clearly some innovation. I talked recently to a colleague from an institution who told us about how they involve students now in the revision of the curriculum. So students become creator of the courses, but they also get involved as assessors of the courses. So examples like this are actually quite interesting. And then also, I think what we discuss at the moment with members are the environmental aspects, climate change. I mean, now that we have proven that we can do a few things quite well do online, it would be a bit mad to go back to the old normal and jump into planes and cruise the planet without taking this option into consideration. Some of the challenges and risks, well, a lot of is on the funding side. I mentioned already that there might be less domestic and international students. So that's for institutions that rely heavily on tuition fees. That's clearly an issue. But also while the higher education institutions in Europe are predominantly publicly funded, we expect some cuts there. And we have seen that in the previous crises. They do not happen now today, but they might happen in a year, in 2 or 3 years. So it's likely that there will be more around, and that will hit also the university sector. And something that could be a bit worrying now that institutions prove that they can work remotely and can deliver remotely and by hybrid modes, that might bring up the idea that this could be economically advantages, that there could be some savings made about that. And I think it's very important that we all declare the real costs of this, so what it actually takes to provide a full study experience online. And this is not just online learning, it's also the whole support and the social experience that higher education study experience brings. And the question is, of course, also what changes will there be to autonomy? And maybe we hear more from this from Hans, given that we have emergency laws and regulations at the moment, and they should finish at some stage, but in some countries they might also be continued and taken as an opportunity to limit autonomy. I think so far we haven't seen that. Can I have the last slide, please? That's just a bit of advertisement here and an opportunity for you to find some information and also get involved with us. Colleagues of ours published, based on the experience in the 2008 crisis, what could be a likely impact of the COVID-19 crisis on university funding in Europe. This is available on the website. I provide you the link. I would also encourage you to participate in an ongoing survey on digitally enhanced learning and teaching. This is mainly for the universities based in Europe. And we just prolonged the deadline to 19th of June. And then we also have upcoming events, and the best is to look at our website. We have a webinar the day after tomorrow, precisely on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on learning and teaching. And you're very much welcome to join us there. That's from my side. Thanks so much for the attention.
Uri, you're muted.
I think I'm unmuted now because I would like to thank Michael for this excellent presentation. I think you highlight very important points that we would need to discuss at the end, when we also will have discussed the impact on research and the impact on internationalization. You touched on certain of those aspects already. I think you also called for a joint action from the sector to also remind everyone around the sector of the importance of the whole experience of higher education when face-to-face or online, and that the online is not to replace the other modes of delivery that we knew in the past, and that we hopefully will know again, even though the past is very recent. These 2 months have been like a roller coaster for many, and there is a lot of change to be expected in the near future. But I simply would like to echo again what you just said, that we have to be alert to pinpoint to those who will make decisions on where to go next or where to cut next as well, to not forget about the very important aspects of higher education as it was for long being provided on campuses. So I would now like to give the floor to Marta Losada, who is the Dean of Science at New York University in Abu Dhabi, and you're also a member of the board of the IAU, and you will talk on the impact of COVID-19 on research specifically. And I give you the floor right now so that we have ample time for discussion afterwards. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Hilde, for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. Can I have the next slide, please? So my comments are going to be essentially focused on the impact on research, and I'm going to be really trying to spell out and highlight the impact on 4 main aspects. The first, I think it's really extraordinary, the way the researchers have, in a very agile way, pivoted to perform research that's relevant to the pandemic. The second point is that this has really been very clearly across all areas of knowledge. It has been a research response in a very comprehensive way as far as the contributions from all areas of research. The third, as clearly showed in the survey, is that the pandemic has impacted and it will continue to impact research activities. So what can we really find as a positive, as negative? How do we move in this context? And the fourth one is clearly international research partnerships have been significantly affected. And what is that going to imply as we try to move along and try to continue with certain projects that have a really strong international component? So next slide, please. So the first aspect, covering the 2 first points, is really the research focus and response to and post-COVID-19. What I tried to do is scan very quickly across different member institutions of IAU and look what that response had been, what had been the research focus across these institutions, just by looking at the different websites. And clearly there's the public policy aspect, and I won't go into much more about that. It was presented by Giorgio. I probably talked about more by Hans. But what I do want to say is that mathematical modeling enhancement and the AI enhancement that has come into that public policy contributions is very interesting. So I think it's very interesting to see how we can apply our more recent knowledge to produce, in effect, relevant results for society and obviously for the construction of public policy. Biomedical research is a given in this situation of the pandemic, and it spans not only the new and novel contributions that institutions have done, say, from all levels of the basic sciences, from testing to the lifelong cycle of the virus to possibly drug discovery, and the engineering devices that are developed to also procure these results in a timely way. But really, I think that it's extremely fascinating to look and see the different results that are occurring in law and economics, in the humanities, in psychology, in education, research across all of these areas, and that is very significant. And I think that one of the most important things that I want to stress is how it's very relevant to disseminate these efforts more broadly. And I would make a suggestion to IAU, through you, Hilary, to take advantage of the section in IAU News to highlight these research efforts done by the members of IAU, but segmented by the different areas of knowledge to make sure we have a fair representation, not skewed to only one. That is, of course, very important that it can help as is biomedical research or public policy, but really to see how this has transformed a lot of the initiatives that are going on. The second point of this stronger dissemination is that it can actually allow and enhance potential new partnerships to evolve when you have this sharing of information, and could greatly benefit across countries with the results and the knowledge about the pandemic and its impact. Because there has been a time lag, as Giorgio was describing, clearly the impact is also differentiated, but the contexts are also different. So I think it can provide really very interesting opportunities. I think it's also interesting to dig a little bit deeper in the follow-up surveys that you mentioned that you're going to be realizing in the fall and in 2021 to consolidate even more this research activities and results around COVID-19 and the more very short-term impacts and those that seem to be more long-lasting. So I think that is clearly something that we're going to have to learn about more. I think also we've seen enhanced efforts to bring more resources, at least at regional level. There have been clear strategies that have been put in place in some regions in the world to enhance cooperation in research and to devise solutions for common problems and, say, more aligned context, national context in the different regions. So I think that this is also very important to understand and to also follow up on. The next slide, please. As also your survey showed, there were very clear impact on scientific activities. I mean, strongly affectation of scientific conferences and international travel. This is very clear. But on the other hand, there are also some very interesting consequences that have occurred. In particular, some conferences have become much more inclusive. Some of the major conferences that were going to be realized in March or in April were able to open up on an online version, and the number of international participants increased 3 or 4 times. So that's actually very interesting to recognize how it can become even more inclusive. Constraints that come from, resources in terms of funding, that not everybody has the same levels of funding across the world, but of course visas have always been an issue. It's more enhanced now, this is clear, but it's not that it's non-existent, and the participation in conferences is limited from certain regions of the world to certain others. I mean, it's not completely, a homogeneous flow. New hackathons that were developed that were very inclusive and really tried to develop solutions as well, either in a localized maybe even a city context, but or a region or a national context, bringing it together, not only the universities, but also their engagement with industry and with startups and entrepreneurs. And I think that that's also really interesting. Again, these were the examples that I know of were really very inclusive across many different problematic issues that were affecting the community at large, not only focus on particularities of say, health.
Mm-hmm.
The issue of completion of research projects, Georgia highlighted this, and it was maybe at a small scale level, at the university level, that this was identified in the survey, but clearly at the large scale level. So any research project that needs or is composed of a very large international participation, these are clearly affected by this. And even now, as things may start to improve in some countries and people can start going back to work, I mean, the rules are different. The way you are actually going to be working is different. So the whole timelines and costs surrounding that will have certain implications. But at the same time, I think I want to put a positive note, because I think it can allow for developing new meaningful research opportunities and activities across academic communities and regions. So you might envision cases in which, okay, the travel is more restrained, and so it's more important for me to find construct new partnerships such that the members of my institution don't necessarily have to travel to another country to be able to develop the full research project, but we will have a more enhanced collaboration with local institutions for a given project that's of interest to be done in a different country from where you are. So I think those are some of the pros and cons of this impact on scientific activities. Can we go to the next slide, please? I do want to stress this final slide, what is really essential for research and that we need to maintain and ensure that it's maintained is the free exchange of ideas and collaboration, which we all know is extremely enriching and powerful, and it's really the driver for scientific progress. And it could be a scenario which we're facing now that will enhance that free exchange of ideas, because of the difficulties of travel, because of policies that may be put in place, because of the costs of having to quarantine or things like that, they will not make it feasible in the same way. So I think we need to really think about mitigating adverse policies and strive for these shared values and goals to maintain research in the higher education sector to be just as strong. And some of these shared values that I think that we need to continue to persevere and insist on, it clearly starts with research integrity. Anything that can overcome the biases or the perceptions or the limitations is because we are all agreeing that research integrity is fundamental, and that, of course, includes many characteristics. I'm not going to go into describing that. But I think that it's essential to be able to push forward that agenda, along with, of course, the value that we all have for respect, diversity, inclusiveness, and collaboration, all in the framework of research. So these were the main ideas that I wanted to bring to the table today. And of course, I'm very happy to continue in the discussion.
Thank you very much for this, Marta. You touch on many different points that we definitely will need to dig into deeper when we get to the second version, the second iteration of the global survey. I very much like your invitation to IAU to also indeed highlight the kind of research that is absolutely essential today to drive us out of the crisis that we're in, because the crisis is not only a health crisis, it's definitely also an economic one, which many people also highlight, but a social one and a cultural one. And to try and bring that together and showcase it better is definitely something that I hear and that we will pick up. That's a very good suggestion. Your call on shared values and the need to maintain exchange of ideas as the driver for scientific progress is at the heart of probably what Hans will also address when he will talk about the impact of COVID-19 on internationalization. Not only internationalization of the curriculum or the opportunities for students, but definitely also the internationalization that is required to carry out the kind of research that we need for today, but certainly also for tomorrow. So I'm now very pleased to give the floor to Hans de Wit, who was also the co-organizer of the very start of the IAU series on the future of higher education, short, medium, and long term. And so where you were a full partner, you're still a full partner, and this time as a speaker. So I'm very pleased to now give you the floor and to address and zoom more into the dimensions that impact the internationalization of higher education. The floor is yours, Hans.
Yeah, thank you, Hilke. And sorry, I don't have a PowerPoint because I think the topic I address two topics basically will be more like qualitative than really addressing quantitative data, because the quantitative data has been presented already by Giorgio in the beginning. What I will address is not only internationalization, but also the aspect of social engagement and public policy dimensions, which has been presented by Giorgio out of the survey. What is important to keep in mind is that for all the topics that I will be addressed, the survey, as Giorgio said, ended by April 17. And we're already 2 months further, and that seems very short, but in a crisis like this, things change constantly. And they sometimes change for the good, but also for the worse. So keep that in mind, and I will refer to that. Let me start with the aspect of social engagement and public policy. What Giorgio presented out of the survey results was a very positive image. 86% of institutions being involved in public policy with their governments, with the local community, etc., being very much engaged in the role of science, the role of teaching and learning that contribute to the debate about COVID-19. Social engagement, 45% of the institutions being involved in social engagement. Also in itself quite remarkable, because in many countries that social engagement over far less active than currently has been the case. So that's all positive. The social engagement in particular, as we will show in a blog that George and I will have in University World News this Sunday about the COVID survey, is in particular in this medical field, and that's understanding. Medical universities, medical laboratories have played a very active role in trying to cope with the crisis of COVID-19. So that is very understandable. So other universities who didn't have that kind of possibilities were less engaged with social role, although there have been also many opportunities for discussing about how can we help in social aspects, the society and the local environment. So universities had a positive role in that aspect. They were engaged with the local community, they were involved in public debate. And is that going to continue? That's the big challenge I see. Already 2 months later, now you see in many countries a reaction to that, the role of universities, the role of science, the role of research. All kind of media, right-wing nationalist, populist politicians who now are criticizing science. They are criticizing the advices that they gave to the governments about how to handle COVID-19. They are criticizing even research that we have been doing. So in that sense, the research and the science becomes part of the public debate and not always in a positive way. So we have to learn from that, the positive reactions at the first sight to the role of institutions of higher education now is much more critically assessed from the society as well. And so we have to be better in communicating, we have to be better in convincing about our role. That's a challenge that we face. And with that comes also the points that Michael made and Marta made about autonomy and the importance of freedom of exchange. We see that in several countries that autonomy is challenged, that freedom of exchange is challenged, and we have to learn from that, that we have to do a much better job to communicate our research, communicate our role in society, and try to see how we can continue to convince that international collaboration, research, social engagement in the local community are very important to overcome not only the crisis, but also to prepare for future crises and for the sustainable development goals. We cannot just assume that based on the first positive reactions to the role of higher education, that this will automatically continue to be the case. So there is a challenge there for the short term and the medium term, how we can take advantage of the first reactions in a more positive way than what we see now in reactions in discussions, for instance, in Germany, in France, in Hungary, in the United States for sure, how we can address all those kind of issues. So I'm not that optimistic that we are able to keep that. We have to make much more effort as organizations like IAU and AUA to be taking a more proactive role in saying we are having an important role in social engagement, we have an important role in the public debate, but we have to do it in a very effective way. So that is on the issue of social engagement and public policy. Don't take it for granted that we will be still in the forefront if we don't do an active role. On the internationalization side, we see a little bit of the opposite. We saw, of course, that the negative impact on the short term, and shown in the survey, 89% of the institutions saying that mobility was impacted, was enormous. And still that continues to be the case. So the impact was of degree mobility basically stopped. Students were stalled either in the countries where they were studying or had to go home, couldn't continue studying another way than going online. Study abroad as exchange for your credits basically stopped as well, and there was no alternative for that. International internships and service learning completely was stalled. So many students have been affected, both local students who want to be part of the study abroad experience and international students who wanted to continue their degree either at the undergraduate or the graduate level abroad. So the impact has been enormous. And in that, we don't see that the short term, and if I talk about the short term, we talk about the fall, that will change much. There will still be a lot of chances. And although institutions try to say, well, we are welcoming again international students to our institutions, we want to see if we can create new study abroad opportunities, it's very unlikely that that will be in a massive scale. So as also Michael said, there will be, depending on how you look at surveys, the impact might be between 15 and 70%, but for many countries, Australia, United Kingdom, the United States, where international students are an important part of the funding of higher education, in the fall will still be affected in the sense that the numbers go down, and that will have an enormous revenue implication. And the same is to an extent with study abroad. There will be for the United States, where study abroad as part of their home degree is something like 10% of the students taking advantage of that. There will not be likely that there will be many students having the opportunity to go abroad. In Europe, we don't know, but because still 20% of the students go into Erasmus schemes, and if borders get open, there might be still some more mobility going on in the European context, but we will not reach the 20% that has been the case. So both on that aspect in the fall and the short term, there will be a negative implication. How will that be at the medium and long term? And medium term, I talk about 2021, 2022. We don't know. There are very many people optimistic about that we will return in 2 or 3 years to the numbers that we had before. Vivian Stern in a recent webinar said that she expects that again in the UK, the 600,000 target will be reached in 2 or 3 years. I hear similar kind of optimism elsewhere. I have my doubts about that. First of all, in the sense that there will be a change in the movements of students going. Will they be able to, will they still want to go to countries like the UK and Australia and United States, and in particular the United States and the UK are in challenge there because of the safety, but also of the high cost, etc. So there might be a movement in different directions, but it also might be that many students will not be able to go because of the high cost of study abroad. And if the middle class in the sending countries will be affected, it will have an impact on the study abroad numbers, also in the medium term. And if in the long term they come back, we have still to see that. It should be a long speculation to give exact numbers on that. We don't know yet. We have to monitor that. We have to see year by year what is happening in the impact on the crisis of higher education. And there is already some discussion between scholars and research centers of higher education around the world to see, can we set up some kind of observatory to monitor what will be the scenarios from the midterm and the long term on different aspects of not only internationalization, but funding, students, faculty, teaching and learning, research, etc. That's on the negative side. On the positive side, we see that it has created a rise in alternative options. In particular, virtual options, virtual mobility, virtual exchange, collaborative online learning, as a way that we can create more opportunities for students still to be internationally active. And again, the survey showed that several institutions, 60% if I recall, have been moving into direction to stimulate much more virtual mobility and virtual exchange and collaborative online learning. That's in itself a positive development. It was already starting to happen before COVID-19. More and more institutions were active in collaborative online international learning and virtual exchange. There was support by the Erasmus scheme for the development of that. So in that sense, the COVID-19 has increased the opportunity to do that. We hope that that will not move away when the crisis will be less impacting. But it will also require an active policy from the institutions, from the programs to continue that. Not as replacement to mobility, but in addition to mobility. So make it a much more hybrid model, as also Michael Gable said, would be probably also for international, as for local students, much more the future we have to focus on. Because you would not say that mobility by itself will disappear. Mobility will be an important part of internationalization and also of higher education more in general. But it not necessarily has to be in the massive numbers and with a massive focus as has been in the past. You can create all kinds of much more hybrid possibilities to do that. There are also people who say this has a positive impact on what we call cross-border delivery of higher education. So branch campuses, franchise operations, articulation programs, dual and double degree programs and joint degree programs as an alternative way how to internationalize higher education. So that not students have to move, not professors have to move, but programs and institutions move. And Abu Dhabi is one example of that. NYU, Abu Dhabi, and Shanghai is one example of that. Would that be indeed in the future the alternative way how we do that? Already we know that most of the international students in the UK and Australia are not studying full-time in Australia and UK, but are studying in their offshore programs and in the articulation programs. Will that trend now increase? Because it's much more doable to move your program and then reach the students, then you don't have so much of the risks as well. In particular, I hear in the UK, people like Janet Yeva, who are very optimistic that this will give an enormous impulse on transnational education opportunities. We have to see that because it will require also a lot of investment, and our institutions in the developed world, which are mostly the ones that setting up this kind of activities, have still the funding to do that. Will they get the support from the local communities in the Oscar countries? Will they have the means to support the development of cross-border delivery? That's all still questions we can speculate about, but it's still, we have to wait and see. So also in that aspect, we have to keep track on what are the developments in the short term, medium term, or long term on that topic. On research, Marta has already said a lot about that. I think international research will be even more important than ever before. I mean, the fact that we only can solve the crisis by vaccines is by joint research collaboration. We also can impact the long-term crisis by also research collaboration. So it is important that we keep that going, but it will not automatically go because there is, again, a lot of resistance from nationalist populist governments against research collaboration internationally. We see already that, for instance, the Trump administration tries to block that if vaccines will be developed by the United States, to give it to everybody, but give priority to Americans. That trend you will see in general as well. So we have also to put pressure on governments and on the international organizations that research collaboration is essential for the future that we do. And so partnerships in that sense also are very essential, because only by partnerships we can do internationalization of research, we can only do internationalization of teaching and learning, we can only collaborate to the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations if we are continuing our international focus in partnerships to make that happen. So there are opportunities. Every crisis has not only big problems, but also has opportunities. And we are the ones as higher education sector that have to look at what international opportunities are there. And we have to make that happen. And in that, organizations like IAU play an important role. Also, research centers play an important role, and higher education leadership in general plays a role. So the opportunities are there, but the challenges are enormous, and we have to work constantly on making those opportunities really work. And with that, I leave time for enough discussion, and thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Hans. And so, yes, this is also a wake-up call. So on the one side, we try to also be some more positive, and you stress the many buttons that we have to also press to make sure that this positiveness will be our reality in the near future. I would like to maybe start with a round of discussion and some questions to the three of you. And Giorgio, you're more than welcome to also highlight maybe some other points that come out of the surveys and the monitoring that we do on the side of the IAU, and that you also may wish to highlight out of the survey report. But there's one point that seems to be also linking your three reactions to the presentation, Michael, Marta, and Hans, and that is that there is this increased need to also raise our voice and to show the importance of what higher education is actually to stand for, and that we should challenge reductionists' views also of what a university actually is to mean, or how it is operating in terms of teaching, in terms of learning, in terms of doing research, and in terms of internationalization. So maybe you could react also on that just once more, and say a few words maybe on what you see in terms of those transformations in the future. How can we address that? You gave one indication, Marta, and that is to show the importance of all the various ways in which research is being done today, and showcasing thus the importance and the important role of higher education in society in so many different ways, and even beyond research through community engagement opportunities. But it would be interesting to maybe get back to that and have your reactions on that. And at the same time, maybe touch on another issue that is linked also to your presentations, and that is, do you see the future developments also come with new geopolitical landscapes of partnership and cooperation? Do you see the transformation there also today already being visible? So maybe I will stop there and then see what you would wish to react to that. All four of you, including also Giorgio. And I would like to start with Michael. The image is frozen, so I'm not sure that, yeah, you're there. Okay, but you don't have the mic. So I guess you will have to be given, all four of you need to be given access to the microphone. Is that possible? Yes, Hans, Giorgio, Marta, and Michael.
Oh,
yes, there you go.
Yeah, just to show how yeah, no, I think Hans and Marta also highlighted that quite well. I mean, Marta probably showed more the positive aspects, and Hans gave us all the negative things that could possibly happen. And I mean, both is possible. I think one point is clearly that we have to stand up as a sector and make that point. That cannot be done by individual institutions and their members, so they have to contribute to it, but it needs some kind of coordination, some kind of pooling from associations like IU, EU, EUA, and also the national associations, and also to remind people about this. Hans is absolutely right. You know, it's a bit like the hand clapping and music playing in the evening for the health personnel. You know. As soon as the reopening started, as the lockdown ended, this disappeared. You know, people forget this. So I think we have to highlight this, that this is important. I mean, particularly on learning and teaching, I thought we had brought the proof already in 2012-14 that just replace higher education by providing MOOCs and learning a few skills everywhere. But maybe this needs to be brought into the memory of people and have to care. I think one point is also to say it's not only, I mean, we are not alone there. I mean, that's also a part for the media that faces the same situation. So other industries are very much in the same situation. There is a lot of noise about from populist parties that try to save money and also focus on domestic affairs, and I think we also have to seek alliances beyond the higher education sector, and should not give the feeling that this is only about universities and as if we are the most important part of it. We are important, but it's part of, I think, it's part of society, and we can see how quickly this gets scattered or in crisis situation if there's no longer enough funding there and if there are no structures there to support this. I think that's the part I think that turns out very quickly. You know, what are the structures, the organizations that you need, the civil society, in order to cope with such a crisis? And I think that's also already part to your second question. And what we see is not new. The deglobalization has already started before. I mean, we saw that already with some countries less interested in international exchange and collaboration, also in Europe, or at least in international exchange and collaboration with certain parts of the world. And we just have to stand up to that. And I think that's the other thing that Marta highlighted very much. You can't win this crisis alone. You have to collaborate. You have to collaborate across the borders and internationally. In the European Union, this is a little bit built in, I would say, because nobody understands why you close the internal borders. So that was the first pressure that came up on the union borders, also because we are so much networked, intertwined economically, culturally, and. But I think we also have to stand up to make sure that this is that we have a truly global perspective again in higher education, and this will also have to take into consideration supporting higher education in countries which are much more challenged than we are at the moment.
Thank you very much. Yeah. So you really advocate for multi-stakeholder dynamics as well to ensure that we don't only talk amongst ourselves, but also with the other sectors and make that case. So Marta, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Hello?
there are a few things that I kind of want to state, and I did not repeat certain things I said in the panel we had a few weeks ago, which were kind of a very different perspective from what I presented today. I might say that now, but the first thing is that I do think that whatever are the actual policies that the different nations are going to implement can actually make or break their trajectories in terms of internationalization of higher education and their success in maintaining the strengths and the leadership in research. And I think that we are at maybe at an inflection point in which some countries will just make decisions that are going to have very unfortunate consequences, while others can, you know, on the other hand, benefit because they're people that are not looking at the more inclusive and broader and more, let's say, shared kind of perspective in terms of developing the needs of humanity in general with research and with higher education. So I think that it's probably going to go in many different ways, but it depends on each country of what they're going to do. At the same time, we are facing, I think, a recognition in many countries, and I'm not talking about the developed countries, I'm talking about different countries in different regions around the world that have been able to build up capacity over the last 20, 30 years in a way that it could now be beneficial for industrial sectors that were not developed there. And that precisely because of the borders, because of the closures and the lack of exchanges, the country had to rely more on their home-grown capacities. It would be a way to incentivize these development of some, at least some very focused industries in those countries built on those capacities in a different way. So I think that that's there, and higher education in those countries has a huge role to play and to be able to respond at the right level to make it, you know, very useful and relevant and pertinent and competitive for each one of those countries. At the same time, I do think, and I stressed this before in the panel a few weeks ago, I think that traditional, strong universities in developed countries that are discovering the strength of the delivery mode of online can actually permeate across borders in a very different way from what they have been doing up to now. And that can be something interesting, and it also will depend on the right mechanism that they implement. I would suggest that the most effective mechanism, if they have a very strong partnership with the local institution, that can really be a game changer for them to really develop this strategy very strongly. So, and it will depend very much on the country's policies of if they allow this type of delivery to occur according to their regulations, and if they want to enhance that or not. I think there are needs in certain countries in the world, that there are huge needs in terms of a lack of appropriate coverage of higher education, where that may actually be a good and smart thing to do. And in other places, it can be devastating as well. So I don't think there's one way to look at this. I think that there are many, many different options out there. And that I do think that with very good decisions, the more people can benefit from what we are, at least I hope, aligned here, and what are the benefits of higher education and research. And so that it's our job to actually communicate more thoroughly what we think is really the best decisions to be made.
So, Giorgio, would you like to pick up there, and then I give the floor to Hans?
Yes, just very quickly, I think I would like to stress 2 points which are very important for me and for the general moving forward. One is the importance of institutional autonomy, because it's true, we are probably assisting, start from your second question, we might assist to some phenomena of closure by some governments around the world. We might even assist to more competition between nations, especially in research. So we could see, in a way, barriers posed to international cooperation. But what will happen at the governmental level should not automatically translate at the institutional level. And this because institutions, they still have to remain autonomous. They still have the possibility of collaborating cross borders. And we are seeing this happening even today in some countries. I don't want to mention anyone, but we see some countries where the higher education sector in the country is really going against its own government and is still going towards more cooperation, is still open, whereas the government is trying to close and is trying even to downplay the role of the higher education community. So I would say that one important point is that, as Michael said at the beginning, higher education institutions should also work as a sector itself at the global level, try to defend the values they stand for. So I think I would pass the floor to Hans, because then we will not have time for the questions otherwise.
Very good.
Okay, well, and probably I will already start to answer some of the questions I was reading at the same time in relation to the topic. Of course, I agree with much what has been said before by my panelists, but what I think is one of the key points is access and equity in the future. What will the impact be of this COVID-19 crisis on access and equity? Inequality will increase. That will happen because the strongest institutions, I mean, the impact will be not as big on Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and other top research universities in the world, because they will still have a strong basis. They will still be getting the support to continue, etc. But it will be the rest of the higher education sector which has much more impact, and in particular in emerging and developing countries. If the crisis, like in Latin America and Africa, will increase, that will be having an impact on the public sector and higher education, but also on the private sector in those countries, because they will have difficulties to survive. So it will increase inequality. It will make it much more difficult for getting access to higher education. We have seen a strong increase in massification of higher education over the past decades in all those developing and emerging countries. But it's the question if that will continue. Because the public sector is not having the absorption to accept them, but also many of the middle class that was emerging in those countries will have not the means to go into higher education. So I think one of the biggest challenges will be the impact it has on access and increasing inequality into higher education. So if we don't address that in our policies, if we don't address that in our communication with governments and with international organizations, that we have to deal with access and equity in the future, then there will be a big challenge for us. And that impact will be much bigger in Africa, will be also in Latin America, so much impacted by not only COVID-19, but also with the economic crisis and the political developments there, will be enormous. On the other aspect, geopolitically, I think we also have to look into what does it mean in the relationship we have with China. A very complicated relationship. Although we understand concerns about academic freedom and autonomy in the Chinese higher education community, the trend that in particular in the United States is very strong, not only among the Trump administration, but also about other Republicans and Democrats, that China academics are a danger and a threat. That's a very dangerous development. We have to keep the channels open. We have to collaborate. We have to be critical in our collaboration. But if we are not continuing international collaboration, also with such important players as India and China, that will be very dangerous for the future, not only of higher education, but also for the future of society. So we have really to look into how we can keep all those channels for international collaboration open.
Yeah, I see that the time is ticking, unfortunately, and every time when we get to this point, there are so many more questions that are coming up. But I see the very clear call for a concerted effort to really make the case for the importance of a whole system approach to education. So never stop after the basic to advanced education before higher education, but make the case to the governments around the world about the importance of higher education. I think all three of you made that case very strongly. And we will have we have organized with our partners, in particular also with the European University Association, meetings with associations of higher education around the world. And we will continue those in a virtual space and manner for now, but also face-to-face in the future, because we are all committed to advancing higher education in our different parts of the world and at the global level as well. But it is true that we need probably, and I hear you very strongly, to increase the multi-sectoral dialogues, to call for attention to all the different points you make, not the least the last one you mentioned, Hans, when we have to make sure that there is no geopolitical construct there that would prevent us from developing internationalization dynamics with certain kinds of countries. We need to have the channels open with any country anywhere around the world, and also with those countries we're not used to work with, because that is so important, and one of the highlights of the work that is being done also at EUA, but also at the IAU in the context of the global UN Agenda 2030 on the Sustainable Development Goals, where it calls for collaboration between the disciplines, something very important that was highlighted by all of you in different forms and shapes, and with all the players around the world. The time is too short. I would like to really give you the floor, each of you, for one or two concluding remarks before we get to a close with this. And Michael, please also remind the participants of your webinar tomorrow, because you will dig deeper in the teaching and learning aspects in the EUA webinar. So people will wish to be reminded of the exact time. It's not tomorrow, it's the day after tomorrow, on 11 June. So please remind everyone of the exact time so that they can pursue the conversation on that part with you. So I give you the floor, Michael, for 2 minutes, and each of you for some concluding remarks, please. The mics, the microphone. So who can give, yes, thank you.
You keep me under strict control here.
You're a dangerous speaker, you know that.
Actually, the webinar, oh God, I wouldn't know that at what time. If you look it up at our website, or I can share that later with Giorgio and he can send it round, yeah? And I can send you the link, that might be the easiest. I don't think that I have anything more to conclude. I think the important things have been said. Autonomy, a public responsibility, I think that came out quite strongly. You know, education, higher education is a public responsibility, and we have to remind that. And then also the aspect about cooperation within the institution. There's something in the chat which asks, what is the impact of COVID-19 on cooperation? And it could be both. You know, it could make you more cooperative, or more competition, and see both. Obviously, there is a race for international students, in particular in countries where institutions depend on this. But we see it everywhere, for example, where institutions, for example, receive their funding according to the number of students that they receive from the that they have from the national ministry. That's the same thing in this crisis. One concern that you have less students in the autumn, and so you start to compete. And I think we have learned to, we need, it's not to take all the competitive element out, but we have to make sure that there's enough room for cooperation, and that this does not become destructive competition. I think that would be the main concern there. And I think if you set the right framework here, indeed you could have ways of collaborating. It was shown for research, for example, where it is absolutely necessary. And it's currently a discussion, for example, in the European Union on how you can have more collaborative research on the pandemic issues. So these kind of things, that's what we would need in the future.
Okay, thank you. Hans?
Yeah, I was thinking about Ross Hudson's question, which he always asks important questions, but impossible to answer questions. What is the impact that the crisis will have on internationalization in the future? But in summary, what I would say is, and Philip Albert and I have been writing about it before, the inclination will be, we've reset the button to what was before the crisis. That will everybody want to do. They want to have the international students coming back. They want to have the study abroad coming back. They want to go back as quick as possible to normal, because that's their survival. That's a logical trend. And that is not going to happen. For that, the impact of the crisis is much bigger than any other crisis we have seen over many decades happening. Because also COVID-19 was already developing something what was already happening before. We were already questioning the whole competitive revenue-oriented internationalization approach. We were already questioning if we would have the dominance of English and language in higher education. We were already questioning if we should not have a much more climate change impact on internationalization. COVID-19 have made that much more to the forefront. We cannot go back to what was business before. We have to reimagine the future of internationalization. And we have to do it in a different way and with a different focus, much more focused on what also IU says, the Sustainable Development Goals, much more focusing on the impact it has on society. So be less competitive, be more inclusive, be less unequal, be much more focused on collaboration. That will be what the impact has to be. If it happens, that's another question. That's why we need still to drive that agenda, to convince people that's the only way forward we can go.
Thank you. Yes. There's another question coming in that's quite interesting. We don't have time for that one, Adel El-Zaim, but it's a good one. I will say a few words about that at the very end, but I first want to give you the floor, Marta.
Yeah, thank you. I think that really we're going to be facing next few years the real result of the impact on the economy. And Hans has already been very explicit about how that can actually constrain very severely in, you know, certain contexts for certain countries. And I agree with that very much. I think that it will also have not only a very strong or significant constraint for the higher education sector. I think, going back to my specific topic of research, I think that that will also necessarily be very, very strongly affected. And it's, I think, it's a very negative moment, because it was a time, we were at a time, I would say, in which we would see more significant contributions coming from a larger number of countries, of researchers that have returned to different countries and were, you know, contributing to a significant global research from those regions. And the economic consequences of that will make it, you know, depress it more, and it's not clear how long it will take to recover. On the other hand, always trying to find some positive spin on that, it may be that it can allow a more localized, at the regional level, concerted effort towards very crucial problems and research that it is relevant in those different regions. But I do think that that would just, in some ways, in the end, contribute to more inequality, because precisely one way to combat that inequality was to ensure higher capacity of all the faculty at the same level internationally, but distributed around the world. And if that is going to be missing, and it's going to be a less of an attractor for people of different countries to go back to their countries of origin once they are really at the more competitive level, that's going to be really, really an enhancer of inequality.
Thank you. Very important points there as well. Need for more discussion in the future. Thank you for those points for reflection. And Giorgio, would you like to comment?
I just would like to say one final sentence, because the majority of the other speakers said already much. One point we should not forget: we are still in the midst of the crisis. I mean, in some parts of the world, the crisis, the health crisis, has been over. In some other parts of the world, we are really in the development phase, or we are at the peak of the crisis. So it's very difficult, once you are inside the crisis, to make a reasonable forecast how the crisis will evolve. So we are living in a time of uncertainty, and this is something we have to keep in mind, because every time that we have uncertainty, of course, we have challenges, many challenges, so we can see the future very dark. But on the other side, when we are in the midst of a crisis, there are also opportunities opening up, and we have to learn from the crisis. I think us as a sector, as our education sector, we have to learn from what we have done correctly in the crisis. We have done a lot of interesting things, and we also have to learn from the mistake, because everybody has probably done some mistakes, and we have to see, while we are evolving, how we can avoid to repeat the mistakes, and how can we profit more of the opportunities coming up.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, I think there is more food for thought than answers that we provided. There was one key sentence that many of you pronounced, the question on what does the future exactly look like. We do not know, yet we can help shape it. And that is the important point to also take away. You've said it all of you. We need to help shape the future out of higher education, and we cannot just stay silent and wait and see what will happen. And that is absolutely important. And that is also where I would like to challenge two new taglines that are coming up in our midst. The first one is that many call for rebooting education. And that to me echoes, and I'm against that terminology. Maybe I speak for myself, but I think it echoes what you just said, Hans. Rebooting would mean that we erase what has happened now and we just start all over from where we left when we entered into the pandemic. But no, this is an opportunity to rethink what we do and to move into the future instead. So not to reboot, but to rethink is something else. Not throwing away what was good, but build on the excellent things that do exist and have continued. And I think, Michael, you were very strong in that as well. Higher education has been put to a certain halt, but it has not been discontinued. Universities have worked enormously over the last 2 months to try and provide for what Chitre City Amorn is also asking for, to provide for quality online teaching with the challenges that were there, to invent pedagogies that people didn't have enough knowledge about, to invent the way to pivot online, as Marta was also stressing, to invent the way to move internationalization in a different direction. So there is a way forward, and we are to play a very significant role in defining not only the future of higher education, but a future of a value-based society for the future of all. And that is absolutely essential. So there is a second term that is coming up that I also would like you to maybe help challenge in the future. And that is that tagline coming from the UN and calling to learn back better. I don't think we need to learn back. We need to learn into the future. So I think you all made that case very strongly. Higher education has a strong role. It is very vocal now, and let's make sure that those who clapped for the healthcare sector and clapped for those who helped continue with the good education all through this pandemic, that we will continue to rejoice about the many, many opportunities of higher education for our future of us all, but all together. So I think there is no ending words to this webinar possible, nor needed or desirable. This is a series on the future of higher education, short, medium, and long term, and it's an ongoing reflection. I thank you very much to the presenter, Giorgio, for the excellent reactions to it by you, Marta, Michael, and Hans. Thank you for your questions in the chat box. I hope it triggered other discussions for the future. And follow the webinar that is now announced in the chat box with EUA tomorrow. And we offer a new webinar next week on the importance of value-based higher education, where we will zoom in on academic freedom and what it can bring and should bring higher education also into the future. So thank you very much also to CIHE for the continuous wonderful support, also not only technically, but also content-wise. And thank you for all the participants for having stayed on and for your excellent questions. We continue the discussion into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.